So thank you very much, Lorna and Bill.
Thank you, Maria, and hello everybody. So yeah, I'm Lorna Wilkinson, Chief of Nursing and Midwifery at Frimley Health, but until 5 months ago I was actually in Salisbury, which you'll see that's a bit of flavour of that through what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. So if we can go into our next slide, please. So I would say that key to any escalation is in the planning, and how we communicate is no exception to that. We, like as Karen just talked about earlier, we're not perfect, I'll say at the outset in terms of Frimley Health. I don't think anybody is perfect. We're all seeking to improve, and we haven't colluded on our talks this afternoon, but there is so much that I think you'll hear that we have in common, and definitely some key themes that will come out of it. So I would say in terms of all of that escalation planning, communication feels as though it's the one that we can leave to chance, if I'm honest, and I would suggest that we do that at our peril. And for all of us, we should be preparing for the unexpected, as we do for major incidents, but also the expected, such as our seasonal pressures, which are, you know, part of our everyday sort of working in the NHS. And communication is central to both those common and the rarest scenarios. And it was the biggest area of learning in our first Novichok incident in Salisbury. That was obviously a huge multi-agency event, and communication was absolutely key to the success, I would say, in terms of managing that 5-month long incident that we had. And I would say then going into obviously 2020 and the COVID pandemic, we've equally learnt a lot around communication through that, and some really common themes that I would say we picked up from Novichok ran through COVID this year, and at Frimley Health I think would now become business as usual in terms of how we deal with pressure, certainly across our system. And I would say all of us probably have experienced, we communicate all the time, but how effective is that communication? And particularly at times of pressure, we tend to put the foot on the gas in terms of let's have more calls, let's have more meetings, more touch points in the day. But actually, how many of us walk away from those calls and either don't really understand what is going to happen? Do we understand each other's language? And as Karen alluded to, how do we know what actually has had an impact versus hasn't? And who has just walked away from that call not actually feeling the pressure at all? So I think we can often have a very, very different view on what communication actually means, and certainly in terms of when we're in escalation. So if we go on to our next slide. So we've broken our talk down into, we think, 2 elements that are vital to effective communication across systems, and that is the actual structure of how you're going to communicate. And obviously that will be through verbal communication, but also we're communicating hard data and information. So how do we do that? What are the mechanisms? What are the hard lines around that? But then also it has to be built on relationships. And they are absolutely key, the relationships and the trust. So if we move to our next slide, and Bill's going to talk about the structure that we currently run in Frimley.
So I'm going to start actually by talking about internal communication, which perhaps sounds slightly odd when we're talking about communication around a system. But I think one of the things that's really important and that we've come to understand is that there are large numbers of people in your organisation who will have touch points of your broader system throughout a working day and certainly throughout a working week. So there are obvious touch points around executive directors, discharge planning, etc. But actually there are a lot of softer touch points as well around our organisation and into our system. And one of the things that we've put in place since COVID actually, and the real introduction of Teams into the NHS lexicon, is something called, we call it the daily TOC call, which will mean nothing to any of you, but is the TOC is the Trust Operations Centre, so it's sort of the gold command of the trust. And at 8:30 every morning, we have a Teams call with about usually between 70 and 80 of our top leaders in the trust. It's a 15-minute call. It's a structured call. But what it does is it allows everybody in the organisation to understand what's happening in the organisation at that point in time and for the day and maybe a few days going forward. So we're a multi-site organisation, so we present where we are with our ED performance and our beds and everything, all on that call. And then any of the areas of the organisation, so the associate directors for surgery or medicine, they all have a slot to talk on that call, and it has evolved over time, and it does take some discipline to make sure that people use it in the correct way, but it is 15 minutes incredibly well spent within the organisation and within the system, because the messaging that moves out from our organisation into the system is consistent because everybody's hearing the same thing. We also have our normal daily calls. We have weekly calls for lots of different purposes. We have quality calls. We have a COVID-19 call at the moment once a week. It went up to once a day during the height of wave 1. The system chief executives have a call once a week when they talk. The medical directors have a call as well. So there are lots of touch points through the week that allow us to communicate both data and also just face-to-face effectively on Teams. We are quite lucky in that we have a relatively small system, so it's relatively easy to get together. I think we're also quite lucky. Lorna is a newcomer to Frimley Health and to the system, but we have a really relatively stable group of leaders within the organisations in the system and the system itself and our organisation. So actually we have had time and we have spent time building those relationships between ourselves. So now it's not unusual for system leaders to be in contact several times a day by Teams call. It could be a text or WhatsApp. But actually the Teams call makes it a little bit easier because it's almost a face-to-face meeting. So it does do away with some of those sharp edges that you sometimes see on emails and other forms of electronic communication. So I think that's been incredibly helpful to us as well. But we have spent a lot of time building our relationships and helping each other through difficulties, because I think when you spend time and you help someone for what might be a relatively small problem at the time or feel like a small problem at the time, when you have a real genuine large problem, that pays back in spades, and so we can't emphasize that enough, I don't think. Next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit, I've talked a little bit already about the building of the relationships. It really truly does require an investment of time, and sometimes that's very difficult, particularly when you're under great pressure from unexpected things like COVID-19. But I would say when things settle down, when you have those quieter periods, if you can spend some of that time building relationships with other people in your system, you will reap the benefit in spades. We all own it, so every single member of the system owns the problem, and I heard the last speaker talking about the fact that, you know, it's not necessarily an acute problem, it's a system problem, and I think we've really moved to that. I think Lorna would agree with that. We talk a common language, we use common data, we're prepared to share both ways, from the system and into the organisation, and from the organisation into the system. So just this morning, you know, some of the data that we'd shared with part of our system, they wanted to then share it with a local authority. So actually, that's absolutely fine, and it just helps everybody within our broader system understand where we're coming from when we're talking as the acute trust. And similarly, they will do the same to us, so we get an understanding of where their stresses and strains are and their limitations are. We are very lucky, I think, in that we have an extreme, as a clinician, that we have a very strong clinical voice in all of this. So the medical directors are important in this, and similarly, so are lower levels of clinical leadership. So our chiefs of service, who are the sort of the clinical leads for our individual areas, they are all involved in systems meetings. They have all got relationships across the system with primary care colleagues, etc. So I think we're very lucky to have that clinical voice, including the nursing voice as well. So there's a very strong quality and nursing dynamic within the system, which I'm sure Lorna will talk a little bit more about. But it gives us the ability to challenge each other and to have some quite difficult conversations at times, but without breaking the relationships. We all understand the pressures and where people are coming from, and that makes it just that little bit easier to have those difficult conversations where you might not want to have that conversation, but it's really important that you do so to get the patient care working properly.
Okay, so key messages that we would suggest, really, we've talked about these: building the relationships now and continuously. It does take time, it does take investment, and it doesn't happen overnight, actually. So it's really important, as Bill said, no matter what, how pressured we are, take time to build those. Be clear on the joint ownership and risk share, and I know that there is going to be a session on that this afternoon. I think that's really important around the risk share, those common aims. Karen talked about that sort of that common aim around our people, our population. I would say, the difference for me coming into Frimley Health, which is a mature system, is that system work is everyone's business. It's not about the coup doing urgent and emergency care. This is about everyone. So it is about the chiefs who are on a weekly call. It is about senior nurses who are on weekly quality calls. It is about all of us as execs. We have our own place-based board meetings that we're linked into, and it really does become part of your role. You're not just talking about your own organisation who might employ you at that time. So I think that sharing out that responsibility into the BAU makes a huge difference. Defining the structure for communication, I think, is really important. As I say, I think too often we leave it to chance without really thinking about how we're communicating and whether that is working, whether it's effective or not. And are we communicating effectively for all of our partners? And again, just taking that time out to consider that. And then my final conclusion, which I've used in various talks that I've done, even, major incident talks, is that, and I think it just translates right across everything we do: communicate, communicate, communicate. When you think you've done enough, redouble it, go back to it. Are you really there? Because you can guarantee you won't be. Okay, thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you.